Hey, World History students. Exciting. Here's our last lecture of the semester, and it is on medieval freedom, or as we were talking about in class the other day, constitutions, and just the contribution of medieval Europe to modern day constitutions and notions of liberty and limited government. Exciting stuff. But actually, it is. It really is. Let's jump right in. So, where this idea of limited government, the idea that the people in charge cannot just do whatever they want with you, because we kind of that sounds normal to us because we're from the United States and we live again in Western civilization with these principles, um, and yet we don't appreciate that basically that for most of history. It was simply the strong can do whatever the strong want to do. And if you don't want them to do it, well, you better get stronger than them. But from the Judeo Christian legacy, we get this notion of a limited government, arising from some key principles here that God alone rules, and that kings are appointed by Him, that kings are accountable to God, not God above them. They have certain responsibilities as well as the powers and privileges that they have. The idea from the Bible is that man's deepest devotion is to God, not earthly rulers. In other words, there's a higher law. We have our consciences, we have our morality, we have our righteousness. And so that at times we might even be called and we might be even doing the right thing to disobey a ruler if they are violating the highest law. Or again, in a more secular sense, even, following our consciences rather than the law. And then also the idea that man has an inviolable or inalienable, as the Americans said, freedom because their rights, their dignity, who they are, come from God, not any human being, not from any government, not from any charter, as important as those are, that it all ultimately comes from a supernatural source to which, again, that's where their devotion and true authority flow from. So that scripture and what Christian Europe really began to establish when they, in being Christian, was this idea of that government has to answer to something else, and there's something beyond the worldly governments of the nations. And again, you get even as you track the trajectory of medieval culture, you see that because their secular governments, they were at a low point with the fall of Rome, and yet it was the faith that remained and the faith that became the glue of the society, the faith that they had in common. And it's going to be out of that faith that a kind of a reconstructed sense of government is going to be formed. And again, that reconstruction has faith or God and the spiritual truths above the political truths. We even see this in feudalism as it developed. Again, feudalism we discussed as being a kind of contract between two sides. Yes, there was the kind of the superior lord and the inferior vassal, but each side both had responsibilities. And so, in other words, even though the lord was in charge, if he did not fulfill his investiture, if he did not fulfill the things that he had been called to do for the serf, sorry, I'm having some trouble here, then he could forfeit his authority. And so that meant as these lords grew into Lord of Lords and Kings of Kings and more kings of nations, there was still this attitude among the people of Europe that king still kind of owes us something. That king there is a bit of a restraint or a chain or a limitation placed upon him based on the contract between ruler and ruled. You also have the fact that the law of the feudalism, as we said, was kind of bottom up. It was kind of a rebuilding of custom, a rebuilding of tradition, a rebuilding of culture as people just practically learned to survive in a new environment. And so law was established kind of among the people, not necessarily like in a truly democratic sense, but kind of because it was from the bottom up by the consent of what works, not some sort of arbitrary top-down rule by some centralized authority. And so that's going to mean that if you want to rule or have authority in that kind of a society, you're going to have to acknowledge the customs and the traditions and the practices of the people. And you're going to have to protect those things and you're going to have to maintain those things. You can't just come in and say, I'm in charge, I can do whatever I want. They're going to say, no, this is how we've been doing it. This is the common law and the custom we've established. And your job as our ruler, yes, you can be our ruler, but you've got to uphold this or else you're illegitimate. And so point two and three, we're just going to look at the two examples we've looked at in class. The first is the Magna Carta, the Great Charter, or as I like to call it, the Big Letter, from 1215. This is the one signed by King John of England at Runnymede following his defeat at the hands of the nobles of England. And again, it established the rights of the nobles and it established the rights of the church. And basically took that king and said, hey, you are not free to do whatever you want. You are linked to the laws, the customs, and the liberties of the people of England. Now, it didn't necessarily mean they were treating everybody in England equal, but even to have a king say to his next level of subordinates, nobles and barons um, and lords, to say, no, you can't do whatever you want. You need to consult with us. That was a step in the decentralization of power and the limiting of government. In the charter, that says you can't touch the church. The church is going to be free from your government. It established the common laws of the people. Throughout the letter, and as we read or the charter, as we read in class, it says the laws of the people, the customs and the traditions of the people will not be violated. That's common law. That's the bottom up laws saying, hey, this is how we run our country. You can rule, but you've got to acknowledge those. What is that basically doing is it's most famously taking the king and placing him underneath the law. And this idea of no man is above the law, that comes from this idea of the Magna Carta, that the Great Charter is that there is law above, no one's above it, and everyone is subservient to it. And again, that's just when we say limited government, that's what we're talking about, a government limited by whatever law, traditions, customs, or consensual agreements that the people come up with. Just two depictions. Again, this was, I like the one on the right because this was not something that King John signed like, yay, Declaration of Independence, I'm so proud of this. No, this is basically kind of a restraining order that he's having to sign. He tries the road of might, he fights, but he loses, and they say, okay, you want to maintain your position, sign on the dotted line. And so he's got to, okay. And he agrees to it. And later kings, they'd each contest it, and it would oftentimes lead to civil war. But the Great Charter kept getting reaffirmed, saying, no, we are going to be a nation not of tyrants, not of absolute monarchs, but of the law, and a rule by the consent of, at least for a time, the nobles, and eventually people, men, and then free blacks, and then women, and on and on and on. A couple of the specifics we talked about in class, but they said the king could not tax without consent of his council. Those were the nobles, his kind of group of men with whom he would parley. Eventually, that's going to become Parliament, which in the United States, we call it Congress. But again, they are these representatives of the people. At this time, these men were not voted in, but that's going to take place. They still kind of represented the interests and the needs of their various little fiefdoms throughout England. They have the legal restrictions, no imprisonment without due process of law. You needed witnesses, you needed just cause, you needed a speedy trial by jury of your peers. And again, this idea that the king is subject to the law, and that if the king violates the law, then the king can be disobeyed and deposed. I should say, not disposed, but disposed of, but deposed. Whoops, typo. And that the king is again under the law like everybody else. And again, kind of a great picture of the king being wrapped up, restricted, and the government limited by these laws and these rights. And they even use the word liberties of the people. Kind of a very revolutionary concept of government that we get from this Judeo-Christian culture in Europe, as well as this kind of feudal, decentralized, bottom-up social structure. As I already said, that feudal council would one day become Parliament, and then a Congress, again representing the consent or the interests of the people towards the ruler. We've got one of the old prime ministers, Tony Blair, sitting next to the Queen of England. England is a constitutional monarchy. They still have a king and queen, but they further completely bound up the powers of the monarchy, and all the power basically resides now in the representative Parliament. The legacy is this idea of rights under the law, that again, the laws protect our rights. We have rights that cannot be violated, again, limiting the government. Separation of church and state, we see that in the Magna Carta. And of course, this idea of the king being under the law is where we get this. We are a constitutional republic here in the United States. We're a republic because we send representatives, we vote them in to run the government for us. We don't do that directly, but even they and us, we're all bound by this thing called the Constitution, which is basically just a law saying this is what the government is allowed to do, and nothing else. And the government is not allowed to do other things. So very much kind of putting a circle or a fence around what the government is able to do so that the people can maintain as much freedom as possible. Our second and final example is an example from Scotland, and that is the Declaration of Arbroath, dating to 1320. And this declaration is a letter of the Scottish nobility to the Pope in Rome. and they're asking for help from the Pope in Rome. And basically, they're not asking for help; they're asking for recognition from the Pope that they are a free and sovereign people, and that King Edward II of England has no right to rule over them. We're going to break this down next couple slides, but you got a picture there of the Declaration that we'll be reading in class. And at the bottom are all these tassels with the seals of the different nobles of Scotland. So like you have the signatures at the bottom of the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution. You have here the seal saying, we as representatives of this land, we all mutually, notice the group, the corporateness of this decision making, we are affirming that we want freedom from England. And Pope, we're asking you to recognize us, because again, we can see the influence of Christendom. Pope is still pretty powerful. They're kind of the highest authority. Hey, our king's misbehaving. Who can we go to? Let's go to the spiritual authority, the Pope. That's what the Scots are trying to do and win and declare their independence from England. Again, a lot of times we don't realize England is the same island. Ireland's kind of separate, but England is just a partition, the northern half of the island of Great Britain. And their struggle with England for independence is a long and storied one. But this is a moment where they were declaring, their Declaration of Arbroath was kind of their declaration of independence. Arbroath was the city at which they all met to write this, and then seal it and have it sent to the Vatican to kind of basically say, can you please get the King of England off our back and recognize us as a sovereign people? The background of this, made famous if you've ever seen Mel Gibson's movie Braveheart, is that the Scottish were an independent nation. Again, the reason you have this division of Scotland and England is because the southern Rome had conquered Britain all the way up to that dividing line where they had the Hadrian's Wall. And then beyond that, you had the wilds of the Picts and the Celts. And so they develop into a separate kingdom of Scotland, and you have the more anglicized and Romanized region down in England. So they have a king, but they die without an heir. And so they make a mistake. They go to the king, the nobles of Scotland go to the King of England. They can't decide who the next ruler should be. They all have their own opinion. So they basically bring in a mediator, the King of England, King Edward I, and say, hey, will you come in and help us decide who should be our king? Edward says, I know who should be. It should be me. And so he invades Scotland with an army and declares himself king. And it begins this time of war for independence, the Scottish Wars of Independence between Edward I and later his son Edward II, trying to seize the crisis of the Scottish throne for power, and the Scots resisting that and fighting back. One of the early Scots to lead a resistance is William Wallace. He's the one depicted by Mel Gibson there. We're going to be watching his speech, a speech from that film in class. And eventually Wallace is captured and killed, but a noble named Robert the Bruce takes on Wallace's cause and the cause of Scottish independence. And at the Battle of Bannockburn, he defeats the English and wins Scottish independence. And it's in this moment following that victory that Robert the Bruce and his nobles write the Declaration of Arbroath, saying, we declare our independence from England. We have here a depiction of Bruce there, famous for his combat with an axe, famous story about the Battle of Bannockburn. We'll discuss in class regarding that axe. And then King Edward I, and then also King Edward I dies during these civil wars, or wars for independence, and his son Edward II takes the throne and continues the fight, but ultimately loses at Bannockburn. So England versus Scotland. Again, I won't go into details of the Battle of Bannockburn here, except that it's kind of their major victory. We'll tell the story in class there of Robert the Bruce wielding his famous axe against the knights of England, and some similarly Greek phalanxy looking tactics by the Scots using long spears to overcome a disadvantage they have against English cavalry. But again, we'll discuss that more in class. Famous quote from the Declaration of Arbroath, 6th of April, 1320, for as long as but 100 of us remain alive, never will we on any conditions be brought under English rule. It is in truth not for glory, not for riches, nor honors that we are fighting, but for freedom, for that alone, which no honest man gives up, but with life itself. The American cry, the modern cry for freedom, that's going to shape so much of Western civilization. It starts really getting developed here during the Middle Ages, as the society, as the rise of papal power or the rise of feudal kingly power, and the people who have determined that they have certain rights under God. They have certain rights under contract of feudalism that these rulers can't violate. That again, this freedom becomes very important. And again, it's just very poetically expressed here in the Declaration of Arbroath. Is for freedom that we fight, and no honest man gives up but with life itself. Again, big ideas from Arbroath. Freedom is the greatest gift of God. It's worth life itself. Trust me, this is a cultural thing. Not every culture believes this, and this is where Western civilization gets its cry for it. It's the idea of rule by consent. There's a famous quote in the Declaration of Arbroath where the nobles say, "We love Robert the Bruce. He set us free, hero of Bannockburn. If he ever decides he's not serving the interests of Scotland and he's not going to fight and keep away England, we're going to get rid of him and get a new king." Okay, that's rule by consent. That means you're in charge, but you're only in charge because we've chosen you. And you can even see, again, you go read the story of the kings of Israel, you see that there as well. And again, this idea that the king is under the law. And as I just expressed, he can be deposed if he violates their rights. And so that we have this famous statue of Bruce holding up the Declaration, though I don't think his horse always had a seagull sitting on its head, but there it is. All right. So what? This is what we're trying to hit home. Medieval thinkers developed this idea of not a generic one of freedom, but one of constitutional government. Okay, what does that mean? It means a government that is limited, a government that has law that tells you this is what you can do, government, king, ruler, noble, pope. You have certain limitations because the people retain their basic rights as people under God, and you, government, have a specific role you should be fulfilling. And whether it's Magna Carta trying to restrict that, or the Declaration of Arbroath, or we're going to look at some other examples, the king's power should be limited by, again, God, the law, and the people, and that their rights, their enjoyment comes from God, not a king. Again, the two key ingredients that we see in the Middle Ages feeding this is you have the intense Christianization, the Christian culture, where God is the highest authority. Again, it was God, it was the Pope that stepped into the apocalypse of the fall of Rome that really saved everybody, kind of rebuilt and held Europe together. And the fact that they kind of were on their own. Things were kind of crazy. Man, imagine you make a life for yourself in a period where there's nobody there for you. And then all of a sudden, once you've made it for yourself and you've come up with how to live and what works for you and maybe your closest people, then some sort of outside person comes in and says, "Hey, let me be in charge." You're not going to have it. You're going to say, "Well, maybe if you do certain things for me, but I'm not going to let you be in charge of everything because you know what? I've kind of learned to be self-sufficient." To some extent, Christian Europe had learned to be kind of self-sufficient, and they weren't wild about the idea of certain kings and god kings and rulers stepping in and taking total control. A lot of times we picture it as a time where kings just kind of completely did whatever they want because everybody said, well, God's in charge, so that king's completely in charge, and they just kind of blindly submitted to authority. That's not the reality of medieval Europe and medieval politics at all. And again, it's this idea that's going to inform modern Western governments. And again, constitutional monarchy, very well expressed in that picture. You can have the crown, but it's held back. It's held back by us and our customs. It's held back by the law, and it's also held back by God. Alrighty, medieval freedom. We'll be talking about that these last couple days of class before heading into review. Take care. See you soon.